They thought she was lost. That was the first mistake. The trailhead parking lot at Blackwater Ridge was empty except for a beat-up Silverado and a late-model Jeep with a cracked windshield. It was the kind of place that looked abandoned even when it wasn't. Gravel lot, rusted gate, a wooden sign that had been shot at enough times to make the trail name illegible. At 6:15 in the evening, the light through the pines came in at that low amber angle that made everything look softer than it was. Peaceful, almost. The kind of scene that made people drop their guard. Sergeant First Class Vivian Marsh hadn't dropped her guard in 9 years. She walked the perimeter path that looped behind the trailhead, her boots quiet on the packed earth, her pace unhurried. Beside her, a Belgian Malinois named Copper moved with the easy, coiled energy of an athlete warming up. He was 4 years old, 72 pounds, and had a scar along his left shoulder from a night raid in Kandahar province that nobody outside a classified file was supposed to know about. He didn't limp, he never limped, but on cold mornings, Vivian noticed he held that side a little stiffer, and she always let him set the pace until he'd warmed through. She was 31 years old, 5'6", brown hair pulled back under a grey cap. She wore civilian clothes, worn jeans, a green jacket, trail runners instead of boots, because today she wasn't Sergeant Marsh. Today she was a woman walking her dog at dusk, and that anonymity was the entire point. She had a phone in her right jacket pocket. In her left, a folded piece of paper with an address and a time, and somewhere under that jacket, clipped to her waistband, was a Sig Sauer P320 that she hadn't drawn in 11 months and hoped she wouldn't need to draw tonight. Copper's nose lifted. His ears rotated forward. Vivian felt it a half-second after he did, that particular shift in attention that meant something had entered the space. She didn't turn. She kept walking, let her gaze drift sideways the way you learn to in close-quarters environments, using peripheral vision the way civilians never think to. 3 men had come around the east side of the Silverado. They were positioned in a loose triangle, 1 behind, 2 flanking, which meant they'd done this before. Disorganized violence had its own pattern, so did organized predation. These men were organized. The one in front was big, maybe 6'3", wearing a red flannel shirt with the sleeves cut off despite the cold. He had the kind of build that came from labor, not a gym. Thick through the shoulders, thick through the jaw. He walked with the casual authority of someone who expected the world to rearrange itself around him. He was wrong about that tonight. Hey. His voice was flat, not loud, the kind of voice that was used to getting results without volume. Vivian stopped. Copper stopped with her, shoulder against her left leg. She could feel him vibrating very slightly. Not fear, never fear. Readiness. She turned to face them with the expression she'd practiced since she was 22 years old, mild curiosity. The face of someone who didn't understand the situation was dangerous yet. "Can I help you?" she asked. The big man, she clocked him as the primary threat, already decided, smiled without warmth. "That's a nice-looking dog, thank you." "Belgian Malinois?" "That's right." The second man, shorter and wiry with a patchy beard, moved slightly to her right. Not threatening, not yet, just repositioning. The third stayed back near the truck, arms crossed. He had a tire iron resting against the Silverado's tailgate close to hand. Professional staging. Vivian noted it the way she noted everything. Catalogued, stored, weighted. "Funny place to walk a dog," the big man said. "Trail's been closed since Tuesday. Washed out." "I know," Vivian said. "I'm not going far." He nodded slowly, like he was considering something. Then, "Where you headed after this?" The question wasn't about direction. It was about whether she had people waiting for her somewhere, whether anyone would come looking. "Home," she said. "Home." He repeated it with faint amusement. "You live around here, near enough." Copper made a sound, not a bark, just a low pressure in his chest, barely audible. The big man's eyes went to him and something shifted in his expression. Interest, maybe. The calculating kind. "What's his name?" "Copper. Copper." He crouched slightly, the way people do when they want to seem friendly to an animal. Copper didn't move, didn't wag, just watched him with that flat, evaluating stillness that people always mistook for calm. Here, boy. Copper didn't move. The big man's jaw tightened. People who were used to dogs being deferential didn't like that. It offended something in them. Unfriendly dog, the wiry man said from her right. He's fine, Vivian said. He just doesn't know you. Maybe he needs to get used to people. The big man stood back up, and his tone had shifted. Just a fraction, but she heard it. The performance of friendliness was ending. You should train him better. He's pretty well trained. Yeah, he looked at Copper again with that same calculating interest, and then he said it, the line that changed everything, the same way that particular line always changed everything for women who had dogs they loved. I bet he'd fetch a decent price. Malinois like that. Military trained, right? You can always tell, Vivian said nothing. I know a guy, he continued, buoys and sells working dogs, cash transaction, he smiled. You interested? The wiry man had moved another 2 steps to her right without her appearing to notice. She'd noticed. The one at the truck had straightened up, moved the tire iron from the tailgate to his hand. I'm not selling my dog, Vivian said quietly. Everything's for sale. Not this. The big man tilted his head. What if I wasn't asking? There it was. The moment when the pretense ended and the reality clarified. Vivian had been in rooms when that moment happened, had felt it in Afghanistan, in a courtyard in Syria, in a parking garage in Baltimore 3 years ago, where 2 men had tried to take a State Department official, and she'd had 7 seconds to stop them. The moment when threat became action was always preceded by this, a sentence that closed the door on all other outcomes. A sentence that said, this is what we're doing now. She looked at the big man with an expression he didn't know how to read. That, she said, would be your last chance to walk away. He laughed, short and dismissive. The wiry man laughed too, from her right. Copper made the sound again, deeper this time. Last chance, the big man said, mocking the phrase back at her. From you and the dog. He glanced at the third man by the truck, some signal in it, and then he looked at Copper with that acquisitive, proprietary look, and he reached out a hand. Vivian said one word, just one. Fass. What happened in the next 4 seconds would later take her 11 minutes to write up in the after-action report, because violence that is trained and precise compresses time in ways that make it difficult to reconstruct linearly after the fact. Copper launched from a standing start with the kind of acceleration that military working dogs achieve because they are not pets and have never been pets, and their entire muscular architecture has been engineered over thousands of hours of training to close distance, control targets, and hold. He covered the 6 feet between himself and the big man before the man's hand had finished its reach, and when he hit high, not the arm, not the leg, the shoulder, which rotated the man backward and down with a force that was genuinely shocking to watch if you'd never seen a Malinois deploy against a full-grown male. Vivian was already moving left. The wiry man came at her from the right, which meant he was now a half-beat behind where he expected to be relative to her position. He had something in his hand. She identified it as a collapsible baton, partially extended, and he swung it in a wide arc that was designed for intimidation more than precision. She stepped inside the arc, which is the place you go when someone swings wide, and she used his own forward momentum in combination with a palm strike to his solar plexus and a foot sweep that took his base out from under him. He hit the gravel hard on his left side, and the breath came out of him in a single, involuntary exhalation. She was already turning. The third man, tire iron, 6 feet of distance coming at a run, was the most dangerous of the 3 because he had the most time to observe, which meant he'd seen what happened to the other 2, and was angrier and less careful because of it. Anger and carelessness were a particular combination. He swung for her head, which she ducked under, and then she drove an elbow into his forearm, the arm holding the iron, with the specific intention of disrupting the grip, which it did. The iron hit the gravel. He threw a left hook by instinct, which she absorbed on her forearm and turned into a wrist lock. And the lock went to a takedown, and the takedown went to a controlled position on the ground with his right arm behind his back at the angle that communicates very clearly that further movement will result in pain. He stopped moving. Behind her, Copper had the big man pinned and was waiting, not biting, not thrashing, just holding him in place with the kind of professional patience that was somehow more terrifying than fury would have been. The man was frozen, breathing in short, panicked bursts, his eyes wide and fixed on the dog whose face was 6 inches from his. The wiry man on the gravel was still trying to get his breath. The evening birds had gone silent in the pines. Vivian stood up from the third man slowly, keeping her eyes on all 3 points of the triangle. Her own breathing was elevated. She could feel it, but controlled. It always elevated. Anyone who told you their heart rate didn't climb in a physical altercation was either lying or hadn't been in enough of them. "Pashed," she said quietly. Copper stepped back from the big man and came to her left side, where he sat and resumed the watching stillness. The big man lay on his back in the gravel, staring at the dimming sky, chest heaving. Vivian looked at him. She looked at the wiry man, who had gotten to his hands and knees and was staying there. She looked at the third man, who had rolled onto his back and was holding his shoulder with one hand and looking at her with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of someone who had been operating under a fundamental misapprehension about how the world worked, and was now revising. She reached into her jacket, not the gun side, the phone side. She made a call, 2 rings, and when it picked up, she said 4 words, "I've got a situation." Then she sat down on the tailgate of the Silverado and watched the 3 men on the ground and waited. She became aware, in that stillness, of what she'd been carrying all day. Not just the cig, not just the folded paper, but the weight that had been sitting behind her sternum since she'd gotten the call at 0600 that morning. The call that had interrupted her coffee and the civilian morning routine she'd been trying, with partial success, to build for herself in the 14 months since she'd separated from the army. The call from a man she'd worked with in the 75th Ranger Regiment, retired now, running security contracts for private clients, who had said, in the careful language of people who used to work in places where phones were monitored, "We have a package that needs to move tonight. Low profile, the usual way." The usual way meant no uniforms, no visible security, no convoy. It meant 1 person and 1 dog in civilian clothes, walking a route that a threat actor wouldn't expect a military escort to use. It meant Vivian. She hadn't wanted it. That was true, and she was honest enough with herself to admit it. 14 months of trying to be a person who woke up in the same place every morning, and drank coffee and went for runs with her dog, and maybe, eventually, figured out what came next. 14 months of that, and she'd thought she was getting somewhere. She'd thought the distance between who she'd been and who she was trying to become was finally beginning to close. Then the phone rang, and the distance collapsed, and she was back. Copper pressed his head against her knee. She put her hand on his skull, the wide, warm dome of it, and felt him exhale. "Good boy," she said softly. "You did good." His tail moved once. He watched the men on the ground. The big man had pulled himself up to sitting. He looked at her with a complex expression that had moved past aggression into something closer to bewilderment. "Who are you?" he asked. "Someone walking her dog," Vivian said. "That's..." He stopped. "Try it again. That's not a normal dog." "No," she agreed. "He's not." She heard the vehicles before she saw them. 2 black SUVs, no markings, coming down the access road with their lights off, which meant they'd had eyes on this situation longer than she'd realized. They pulled into the lot with quiet efficiency, and 4 men in plain clothes got out and moved to the 3 on the ground with zip ties and that particular manner of people who had done exactly this, in exactly this kind of lot, in exactly this kind of light, more times than they counted. The man who came to Vivian was named Conrad. She'd worked with him twice before, once in Ramstein and once in a nondescript building outside of Langley that she was still not supposed to acknowledge had been a meeting she attended. He was 52, grey at the temples, and had the tired eyes of someone who had seen too many parking lots at dusk over the course of a career. "You could have called earlier," he said. "I had it. I know you had it. I watched you have it." He looked at the three men being processed. "These aren't locals." "I know, the one on the right. The big one, his name is Dale Presswick. He's been on a watch list for 18 months. Suspected courier for a network that moves stolen ordnance through the Pacific Northwest corridor." He paused. "The trail closure at Blackwater Ridge wasn't from the washout. We closed it." Vivian looked at him. "You used me as a provocation. I used you as a test." He said it without apology, which she appreciated more than she would have appreciated contrition. We needed to know if Presswick's crew would take the bait, walk a woman alone through their staging area and see who moved, and the package, real, moved 2 hours ago via the north route. You were the distraction." He paused. "You and Copper." She absorbed that, looked out at the pines. The amber light was gone now, replaced by the flat grey of oncoming dark. Somewhere deeper in the trees, a woodpecker resumed its work, apparently satisfied that the humans had settled whatever they needed to settle. "You should have told me," she said. "You would have performed differently if you knew you were being watched. I perform the same either way." "I know," Conrad said. "That's why I didn't tell you." She looked at Copper, who was watching the two SUVs with the calm, proprietary interest of a dog who considered most situations his jurisdiction. His scar was visible in the fading light. That pale line along his left shoulder that she'd first seen in the recovery facility at Bagram, when they'd brought him to her with his head wrapped and his eyes still carrying the flat shock of trauma, and she'd spent 4 hours just sitting on the kennel floor with him, not speaking, letting him understand by proximity and patience that she wasn't going anywhere. He'd been assigned 3 other handlers before her. None of them had lasted. The official report said he was high drive, handler selective, difficult to integrate. The unofficial truth, which she'd understood within 20 minutes of meeting him, was that he was a dog who had been asked for too much, too soon after being hurt, and nobody had given him enough time to decide he could trust again. She'd given him time. He'd given her everything. "The 3 of them," she said to Conrad. "What happens?" "Federal custody. Presswick's going to talk eventually. They always do when the alternative is the charges we can bring. The other 2 are small. We'll use them to build upstream." He glanced at her. "You'll need to give a statement. Tonight? Or tomorrow morning? Your call." She nodded. "Tomorrow, then." Tonight, she wanted to drive back to the house she'd rented in the small town 40 minutes from here. The house with the unfenced yard she'd been meaning to fence for 3 months. The kitchen with the window that looked east, the second bedroom she'd been using as a storage space for boxes she hadn't unpacked, because unpacking them felt like committing to something she wasn't certain she was ready to commit to. She wanted to sit on the back step with Copper beside her and let the adrenaline metabolize the way it did, slowly in the cold air, while the stars came out over the ridge. Conrad seemed to understand, because he didn't push. He handed her a card with a number she didn't need to write down because she already had it memorized. "Good work tonight," he said. "I was walking my dog." He almost smiled. "Right." She clipped Copper's lead back on, though it was mostly ceremonial. He'd walk beside her regardless, and she crossed the gravel toward her truck, the only civilian vehicle left in the lot now. She heard Conrad say something to one of his people, something she didn't catch, something in that low managerial register of someone wrapping a scene. Copper walked at her left side. His tail moved in that low, easy swing that meant he was satisfied with how the evening had gone. She opened the truck door. He jumped in, turned twice, settled. She got in and sat for a moment without starting the engine. The parking lot was lit now by the portable lights Conrad's team had set up. blue-white LEDs on tripods that turned everything clinical and flat. She thought about the phone call that morning, about the weight behind her sternum that had been there all day, about the 14 months of trying to build something that looked like a normal life, and the 3 seconds it had taken for that life to fold itself back into its prior shape. She thought about what it meant that it had folded so easily, so naturally, like fabric remembering a crease. Her right hand rested on the steering wheel. Her left found Copper's ear, and he leaned into it. Here was the thing she hadn't told anyone, not Conrad, not the therapist she'd seen exactly twice before stopping, not the friend from her unit who called every few weeks from Fort Campbell and asked how she was adjusting. She didn't know if she wanted to adjust. She didn't know if the person she was building, in that house with the unfenced yard and the unpacked boxes, was someone she wanted to fully become. That person was quieter and safer, and didn't have to watch 3 points of a threat triangle or say a single word that sent 72 pounds of trained muscle into a calculated strike. But that person also hadn't felt, in 14 months, what she'd felt in those 4 seconds in the parking lot. That crystalline, terrible clarity. The world reduced to geometry and timing, and the complete, unconditional trust between a woman and a dog who had both been through enough to know exactly what the other was capable of. She didn't have a word for what that was. She suspected she didn't need one. She started the truck. Copper's head appeared over her right shoulder, warm breath against her ear, and she scratched the side of his jaw without looking, by feel alone. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's go home." She pulled out of the lot, down the access road, past the rusted gate, and out onto the county highway where the headlights cut into the early dark and the road went straight and long between the pines. No other cars. Just the two of them, moving through the kind of quiet that isn't empty, that's full of everything that doesn't need to be said. Miles later, when the ridge was behind them and the lights of the town were beginning to show on the flat horizon, Vivian reached over and put her hand on Copper's back. He exhaled. She thought about the boxes she was going to unpack this weekend. All of them, every last one.